Hello everyone, my name is Rhys Koszczynski. This is Simple Philosophy, where we simplify philosophers to help you better understand life. And in today's video, we are going to be completing our series on Plato.
All we are is dust in the wind, dude.
Once again, I'm going to be joined by Sean Ledwith, who is going to be sharing his knowledge of ancient history as well as philosophy to go into the details of key ideas within Plato's work. The video is going to focus on Plato's theory of knowledge. We're going to look at Plato's understanding of politics, art, and conclude with his overall influence on philosophy. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave me a comment in the comment sections if you have any questions. And without further ado, let's get into it. So let's start with epistemology, knowledge is recollection then, Sean.
Okay, if you remember in the last little section, we talked about how Plato was from an essentially aristocratic background, and the sort of political agenda of his philosophy was very much to try and reserve political and philosophical power in the hands of the elite. So I think that this particular story sort of is in line with that way of thinking. So according to this story from his dialogue called the Meno, there was a slave boy who, of course, Plato assumes was an ignorant idiot, incapable of doing advanced sort of algebra or geometry or anything like that. But then Socrates, with a few sort of well-chosen questions, is able to guide the slave boy into how to solve this geometrical problem. Now, this is, for Socrates, this is demonstrating this concept of knowledge as recollection, or amnesis in the Greek. Plato has this viewpoint that we all existed in a previous life, which he partly got from the Pythagoreans, that they believed in reincarnation. So when we're learning things, according to Plato, we're not learning things for the first time. What we're actually doing is recollecting things that we knew in our previous life. So according to Plato, the slave boy, along with everyone else, in a previous life actually had a very advanced mathematical knowledge. But through the process of rebirth, supposedly, we essentially forget virtually everything. And the point of learning is to recollect what we already knew in a previous life. Now, of course, to our ears, this sounds like a lot of superstitious rot. But so it's in line with Plato's view that knowledge is very much something that the elite should be controlling. So the rest of us, we can be guided towards true knowledge, but only at the hands of what later on Plato is going to call the philosopher kings or the experts.
Hugely influential on education theory as well. I think some people try and recollect these, to some extent, these kind of ideas in education theory as well.
That's right, yeah. And I think as educators, what we all try to use is the Socratic method in terms of using questions to guide students towards the answers. So, of course, you can separate that from all the superstitious nonsense. And I think the Socratic teaching technique is essentially probably the best one. Is instead of just giving students a lot of answers to learn in a sort of mechanical, rote-like sort of way, the best way is to guide them towards the ideas and for it to come from within. So you don't have to accept all the superstitious reincarnation nonsense to actually accept that Socratic dialogue is essentially the best and the most rewarding type of teaching in any sort of context.
Yeah, and this idea of achieving the truth as well, I think links to what's going to come later as part of the Enlightenment project too, and that's steering towards we can find this eventual truth or universal truth.
Yeah, and also I think the idea that again, education is a dialogue between the educator and the learner. It's not the educator having all the knowledge and then just transmitting it. The old sort of mug and jug view of learning. It's very much that you got two persons who went to a dialogue, and between them they actually work towards a new type of understanding in a way that's actually beneficial for both the teacher as well as the student.
So let's move on to the next one. So the divided line there. Again, another key concept. Okay,
so according to Plato, we can divide knowledge into sort of 4 different levels, with the one on the left, noesis, as the highest type of knowledge. Now, if we just focus on the second one from the left, dianoia, now this is probably best understood as mathematical knowledge. Now, Plato was a great fan of mathematics, again, like Pythagoreans. I think on the over the door of his academy, there was a sort of a Greek inscription: "Those who do not understand mathematics do not enter." So mathematics was regarded by Plato as one of the greatest intellectual endeavors of human beings. But dianoia is not the highest form of knowledge, because if you think about it, when you're doing maths, either on paper or on a screen or in your mind, you do have to visualize the numbers. Whereas noesis, which is the highest level of knowledge for Plato, that was abstract concepts that in many ways cannot be visualized. Things like beauty, truth, justice. We cannot really visualize those. So that's the difference between these two higher levels of knowledge. The two low ones, aikasia, the lowest form of knowledge, essentially believing what you are told by others. And then pistis, likewise, just only using the senses, the five senses. So although Plato is not officially a rationalist, he's very much with that line of thinking that essentially we need to ignore the senses and really focus on pure abstraction. Now, I think in many ways, although there's a lot wrong with this way of thinking, and it does sort of lead towards an inevitable type of elitism, the great intellectual advance of this is that Plato really underlines the importance of abstraction, the importance of using universal concepts and not just relying on the senses.
Well, this is something that's come back recently in philosophy as well, the idea of needing to return back to these abstract senses, because I think the mathematical level of understanding has certainly been dominant in many fields over the past few years. And I think now, particularly with the challenges that we're facing, coming back to this idea of looking at the avant-garde and looking at the abstract is coming back into thinking, all being well.
And again, in terms of our classroom experience, abstraction is one of the hardest things to try and get through to students, to get them to think about concepts like justice, beauty, the good society. Very difficult to try and get over to students, but ultimately, when students are able to think in that sort of abstract way, that's when you make the most progress. Now, I think from our viewpoint, we say that one of the problems with this way of thinking is the concept of the divided line. Plato tends to assume that these are four separate pigeonholes. Essentially, they're essentially cut off from each other. Whereas I think a better viewpoint we would say is that ultimately all these four levels of knowledge are actually required. You do need to use your senses, obviously. You do need to listen to other people in many situations. Mathematics is obviously essential to science, but at the same time, probably an overemphasis on maths and science leads people away from the political impact of maths and science, and that's really where the noesis does come in. People, we do need to think about what exactly do we use maths and science for, rather than just thinking them as ends in themselves. So there's weaknesses with this way of thinking, but I think the great advance of this divided line image was the importance of abstraction and the ability to think in a universalizing sort of way.
Which links us very nicely onto the next section, which is the allegory of the cave, which is one of my favorite of Plato's.
I mean, the relevance of this is just endless. So to explain it in this allegory or this simile, you've got these prisoners on the bottom left who have been essentially locked up for the whole of their life. That they're only looking at images on a wall, but they think it's reality. Behind them, unknown to them, is individuals who are just walking up and down holding objects. And the prisoners are seeing the shadows and the reflections of these real objects, but mistaking the shadows for reality. One of these prisoners escapes, either by fortune or accident or intention, makes their way to the surface and actually sees the real world and understands his or her situation. Now, when that person has spent some time on the surface in what you might loosely call reality, Plato believes that person would feel the urge or the compulsion to return to the cave and try and persuade his or her fellow prisoners to take the same path. But again, in the story, now this is described in the Republic, that person who's been to the surface is inevitably going to face resentment, disbelief, maybe even violence from the fellow prisoners, who Plato believes are going to be much more happy and willing to stay in the cave. This allegory is hugely relevant to our particular situation. I mean, even before the pandemic, if you think about the role of the media. And I think, as you mentioned before, Reece, think about Baudrillard's simulacrum concept is very similar. And the whole idea of hyper-reality is that you countless times of actors who get shouted at by members of the public for what their character is doing in a TV series or in a film. I mean, that is a classic example of what Plato's talking about.
I remember when I first read this allegory, and what I instantly thought of was that imagine if you've left the cave and you've seen things like grass and trees, and then all of a sudden you have to come back in and explain to these people what these things are. They just think you were talking absolute nonsense. But so what seems like common sense to us is just something so far out of the experience of the people that are trapped inside.
And like I say, I think this is why you can make a case for Plato as the greatest philosopher, because this concept, it's so easy to understand and it's so endlessly relevant. And, it's not wrapped up in any off-putting or obscure philosophical jargon. It's just a great story, hugely relevant to all our lives in so many ways. So, like I say, I think this is the single best idea in the history of philosophy.
It's actually become a meme recently, is Plato's Cave, where there's this guy the original meme is this guy at a party stood in a corner on his own, and he sees everyone else dancing and having a good time, and he's kind of sitting there miserable, thinking, these people don't even realise who I am or whatever. And they've kind of taken that and have people dancing inside the cave, and he's stood with a beer on his own saying, you don't even know they're inside the cave.
Well, of course, that's one of the problems, is that, let's say, if you are, in a sense, we're all the prisoners in the cave, and there's lots of people who claim to have been to the surface, and that we're all wrong about various things. So that one of the problems is, well, how do we as the prisoners of the cave differentiate between those who generally have been to the surface and those who are just mad and are just telling us a lot of rubbish? So there is that problem as well.
From the shadows to the light then, so how do we get away from these shadows, or staring at these shadows on the cave walls, towards the light or the outside?
Yeah, so this sums up really what we've been talking about last few minutes. So the prisoners are on the left-hand side. They are in position 1, essentially chained up in the cave. Position number 2, again, one prisoner, again by accident or by assistance, is able to slowly start to see the reality. So that person manages to get out. Moving towards the surface. So for Plato, maths is this sort of level just below true knowledge. So like I say, that inscription at Plato's Academy was to convey this idea that maths is not the highest form of knowledge, but it is an essential means to achieve the highest form of knowledge. So in a sense, in terms of the allegory of the cave, the person who is studying mathematics is proceeding through the tunnel to the surface. But then the surface itself is essentially dialectical reason. So the person who gets to the surface, it takes them a while to adjust. You can imagine the bright sunlight, getting used to things like grass, trees, birds. So for Plato, that is the true philosopher who is trying to acclimatize to and trying to get confidence in concepts like truth, justice, beauty, etc. So for Plato, this is the route to true knowledge. And I think interesting the point about, for Plato, and again, this is one of the potential weaknesses, he doesn't seem to consider the fact that a person might get to the surface and think, well, sod those who are stuck in the cave, I'm just going to enjoy myself up here. He seems to think that the person who's achieved true enlightenment would feel this compulsion to return to the cave and help the fellow prisoners. Now, again, that might be the case, but why would a person who's achieved sort of philosophical utopia might think, well, this is great, put my feet up, and those idiots in the cave, good luck to them.
Which again, back to his concept of philosopher kings.
Precisely, yeah. So that it's the philosopher kings who have reached the surface. To start talking about those, obviously the idea of being run by so-called experts or specialists, Plato anticipates that inevitably a lot of us will be reluctant to believe specialists. I mean, of course, in the year of the pandemic, we've had scientists supposedly telling us what to do, which still seems to have ended up with disaster. So you can imagine a lot of people would be reluctant to follow science. And again, this is one of the critiques of his political philosophy, which we can start talking about, because really for Plato, epistemology and political philosophy are really just two sides of the same coin. Plato doesn't really anticipate the resentment you would get essentially from ordinary people to so-called experts telling them what to do. But the whole point of his political philosophy is, well, ultimately, they need to be told.
So, onto the political philosophy then, the ship of the state. So, this links directly to the Republic.
Yeah, another one of Plato's fantastic similes. And I say this is what makes him such a strong candidate for the greatest philosopher, because he is able to convey complex, stimulating ideas in a very sort of easy to communicate sort of form. So, according to this simile, on this hypothetical boat, you've got on any sort of boat, you wouldn't ask, Plato argues, you wouldn't ask the crew to steer the ship. On a ship, you need a captain. Now, according to Plato, now remember, Plato was growing up in the context of the Periclean democracy in the second half of the 5th century. And as we talked about previously, that democracy is essentially founded on the rocks in the form of the defeat by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. So a lot of this is actually Plato's abstracted attempt to try and explain why did Athens lose the Peloponnesian War. And for Plato, it was essentially because Athens acted as a democracy. There was too much power to the people, there was too much discussion, and there was too much debate. And there wasn't enough control by the elite. So for Plato, conducting a war in a democratic way is just sheer madness. In the same way, it will be sheer madness to expect the crew to be able to steer a boat. So in this story, there is a navigator on the top right of this discussion, this illustration, and again, in an ideal journey, you would have the navigator who would plot the actual course. But for Plato, the navigator, who is the person best equipped to steer the ship, is locked away in the hold and ignored as the crew sort of take over the ship and essentially steer it towards the rocks. So the fate of Socrates for Plato is very much like in this simile, how the navigator is ignored, and the sort of the drunk crew take over and are leading the ship towards disaster. In the same way that for Plato, in the years of the Peloponnesian War, the fact that Athens tried to conduct the war in a democratic manner was a complete disaster, and that's what led to the defeat. Now, in terms of criticisms of this simile, again, very powerful simile, and again, very easy to understand. And even if we don't accept it, great for stimulating discussion. And I think one of the criticisms of this simile is that, of course, for Plato, this is the ship of the state. So the state needs to be conducted by the captain and the navigator, not the people. The people are the worst equipped to conduct the state. And what critics argue is, well, one of the differences between the state and a ship is that the state doesn't necessarily have an identified destination. If we ask the British people today, what is the destination of the British state? You'd have millions of different answers. So that's one of the problems with this analogy. I think it is interesting to speculate if Plato was around with us today, what would he make of modern politics? And I think he'd look at leaders like Trump and Johnson and like shake his head and say, well, look, that's what democracy gives you. Democracy will give you demagogic, populist leaders who are only interested in swaying the people rather than doing what needs to be done. So I think Plato would look at modern politics and say, this is why you need experts. This is why you don't want elected leaders running the show. But of course, the other problem with it is that Plato assumes that the people / the crew are ignorant idiots who are incapable of understanding what needs to be done.
So the last bit we need to look at then is the form of knowledge to power, which again still very much informs ideas in education today.
Remember, Athens was defeated by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War 404. Plato was around for that event. Plato would have observed that event. Plato had reflected upon that event. And I think in many ways Plato's political utopia is really a sort of elaborated version of the Spartan political system. Now, I think the main thing worth talking about on this one is looking about the fourth point down, the metallic analogy and the noble lie which come together. Now, Plato says, okay, most people aren't going to accept rule by experts or rule by the elite. They're going to resent that. So what Plato says is, in effect, the people in his ideal society, which is called Callipolis, by the way, they will be educated from birth that there are essentially three types of people. There are people descended from gold. They are the elite. They are the philosophical elite. They will be running the show. Then there are people who are descended from silver. They would be the army, in effect, the law enforcers, the police. And then there will be the bronze / iron. These will be the working class, essentially. So this noble light would be told to people from birth, and they would be brought up to believe it. Now, Plato says that, amongst the elite, there will be a knowledge. This was a lie. We are not saying this is the way it is, but this is a necessary lie in order to stabilize society.
Reminds you of Batman: The Dark Knight, actually. Have you seen The Dark Knight with the Joker? The Nolan film, where essentially they have to make Batman look like the enemy, even though he's the one that saved everyone, in order to maintain law and order within Gotham, within society. So again, it's the repetition of this allegory in popular culture even today as well.
Yeah, again, the resonance is there all the time. Essentially, all sorts of states require some sort of enemy in order to justify their own existence, and all states have some sort of semi-mythological explanation of their origins. If you think about how the Americans like to glorify their revolution as some sort of great democratic crusade. The Republic, likewise, the French talk about 1789 as a sort of starting point of their political system. So every society does actually have some version of a noble lie. And again, what Plato is talking about is essentially the role of ideology. Okay, now down at the bottom, Plato was the first communist or feminist. Now, this might seem a bit anomalous, considering we're basically saying Plato was a philosopher of the elite. But again, this is why I think it's very simplistic to argue Plato was of the left or of the right, because he does argue that the experts who are going to run Plato's political system, those who are going to tell us that they are descended from gold, who are a minority. But that Plato does very clear in the Republic that these people are to have no personal wealth whatever. They are essentially to have a communist existence, complete financial, economic equality between them, and there's to be no hierarchy within this elite class. Now, again, this is very much how the Spartans' political system was organized. Essentially, each Spartan soldier was given a certain amount of land, and any sort of personal wealth was totally discouraged. So again, Plato clearly very much influenced by that. And then the point about Plato as a feminist is Plato was really the first philosopher to argue that women should be given political power. So the philosopher kings could actually be philosopher queens. There's no reason why a woman cannot be excluded from this elite position. So in this way, Plato was a hugely progressive figure to argue that women could be trusted with political power, really before anyone else.
Okay, so let's move on to Plato's aesthetics then.
Okay, so Plato's theory of art again follows on directly from his view of knowledge. If you look at this little illustration, if you think about it alongside the cave, I think it helps a lot. So down at the bottom, trying to understand the question of aesthetics is essentially understanding, okay, what is beauty? How do we define beauty? Now, for Plato, what we should not be doing is what's going on in the lower level. We should be looking at paintings or sculptures or listening to music or reading poems. Because again, if you think about a painting, many paintings are just representations of real objects. So let's say you think about Van Gogh's sunflowers. You got the painting sunflowers, and then you got real sunflowers. Now, obviously, for Plato believes that Van Gogh's painting of sunflowers is on an epistemological level is nowhere as useful as looking at an actual bunch of flowers. Obviously, a real bunch of flowers, you can walk around them, you can touch them, you can feel them. But a painting of sunflowers is never going to repeat that sort of aesthetic experience. So just above that, second one up, that would be looking at actual sunflowers. But again, of course, the problem is that sunflowers, like every other object, degrade over time. Again, you think about what's a candidate for the greatest painting. Many people say, well, okay, the Mona Lisa is the greatest painting. But of course, the Mona Lisa, it might take thousands of millions of years, but the Mona Lisa will not always exist. So we for Plato, we cannot use objects in the actual world to help us understand what beauty is, because they will not be there. If we want a definite understanding of what beauty is, we have to find something that is essentially infinite and cannot be degraded or damaged in any sort of way. So the concept of beauty, again, going back to the divided line analogy, many people who love maths will say there is a great beauty in mathematics. The fact that mathematical solutions can often be devised over a huge complex process. I'm sure that for people who are good at maths, that there is a sort of satisfaction to be to be gained from solving a sort of a mathematical problem. But again, the problem for Plato is that, you know, your maths, you have to do it on paper or screen or even in your head. You have to visualize the mathematical concept. So true beauty, according to Plato, is something that we cannot access using the five senses. Now, again, so the person who can understand true beauty is, again, the person who's been to the surface. True beauty is something we can only access in a purely conceptual sort of way without any influence by the senses. Now, one of the downsides of this is that Plato is not a fan of any sort of aesthetic enterprise that involves the senses. So again, in the Republic, he famously calls for essentially all poets to be booted out, and anyone engaged in any sort of aesthetic enterprise. The only sort of aesthetic enterprise that is acceptable, again linked in with a political philosophy, is essentially art as propaganda, which again, from our perspective, you know, having seen how dictators like Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini have used aesthetics for propaganda purposes, that is not appealing to us.
Yes.
Just the second point there on the mimetic conception of art. So mimetic basically means, again, think about Van Gogh's sunflowers. Of course, they do look like real sunflowers, and for Plato, that would be the only form of art that would be acceptable. Now, again, I think one of the ironies is, in many ways, if you think about the really abstract artists, people like Rothko, who just paint things like a black square. In many ways, that is actually, I would say, more true to the spirit of Plato, because if you look at the black square, if you get up close to that sort of thing, it does actually stimulate to think in a very sort of abstract sort of way. But that Plato would just throw that on the fire as a complete waste of time. So that's a slight sort of irony there, that I think that the most Platonic form of art, the really abstract art of the 20th century, the sort that Plato would not be interested in.
Okay, so let's finish off then. Let's just talk about Plato's influence, which I don't think is even not even debatable, is it? He probably is one of the most influential philosophers, particularly in the West as well. But obviously, we can expand upon this in various different directions.
Yeah, I think you can question whether Plato is the greatest philosopher. You cannot question Plato's greatness. His greatness is incalculable. And I think this line from Schopenhauer in many ways sums it up, is that Christianity, centuries after Plato, through philosophers like Plotinus particularly, who talk about Neoplatonism, Christianity very much absorbs and assimilates the Platonic view. And again, if you think about the allegory of the cave, it's very much essentially how religious people think, particularly within Christianity. Obviously lots of focus on trying to avoid the temptations of the world and not believing what you're told. And then, of course, the church will present itself as the true path.
Move towards the light. Move
towards the light, precisely. And, of course, heaven is regarded as reaching the surface. So in that sense, Christianity and Islam as well, and a lot of the monotheisms of the West very much assimilate and absorb Plato. And I think the point about Aristotle, just to talk about Aristotelicism of Plato's theory of forms, is that I think Aristotle, as why it goes, the best criticism of theory of forms is that for Plato, concepts like blueness, redness, yellowness, justice, they exist within themselves. But Aristotle argues that although these concepts are important, these universal concepts, they are immanent, as Aristotle would say. In other words, they can only be attached to either particular people or particular objects or particular events. So we can talk about a just person, a just society, a just act. But for Aristotle, we cannot talk about justice in itself. Likewise, we can talk about the red pen, the red table, the red shirt. But to argue that redness exists within itself is just taking abstraction too far. And I think as a critique of Plato's theory of forms, this has never really been bettered. So the point about now, Islam, of course, played a huge role in terms of preserving Greek thought in the Middle Ages. And it was really thanks to Islamic scholars in the sort of early modern period who preserved Plato's writings that Plato was rediscovered in the Catholic Church. And in the Renaissance, people like Leonardo and Michelangelo, again, there was a great rediscovery thanks to Islamic scholars of Platonic writings. So now Michelangelo had this viewpoint that, think about his great sculptures, things like the statue of David. Michelangelo believed that, when he got that block of stone, the statue was actually inside the stone already, and that all he had to do was to try and sculpt it using his skill and his genius, obviously, but very much the idea that the form of David was inside the statue, and he had to just take it out, which in some ways is similar to Plato's view that that noesis, the higher level of understanding, is something that we have to work at and chip away at. It's out there waiting for us to actually reach it, in the same way that Michelangelo believed that the statue of David was already in that block of stone. So again, Plato was a huge influence on those sort of Renaissance thinkers. Down at the bottom about Derrida, regarded Socrates as really, in Derrida's deconstruction, again, speech is prioritized over writing, because speech is more dynamic, speech is more of the moment. Of course, Socrates never wrote anything down, whereas Plato, of course, wrote everything down that mattered to him. But for Derrida, as I understand it, the theory of forms is a classic example of logocentrism, because the theory of forms is very much the idea that the truth is out there. It's in a fixed, objective, static way, and we have to, in terms of going up the path, we have to reach the truth. Whereas, of course, for Derrida and the postmodernists in general, truth is much more of a relative idea, and it's pure logocentrism, to use the terminology, to believe that the truth is something that exists objectively. So just summing up, I've said a few times, I don't think Plato can be appropriated either by left or right, or you can't denounce, you can't regard him as a reactionary or a revolutionary. He's such a multi-dimensional sort of, there's so much to his philosophy. It's really just, it's not worth classifying him. And I think there's this story by a later writer called Olympiodorus, I think encapsulates, again, very poetically, the nature of Plato. Is that Plato had this dream, according to Olympiodorus, where he envisaged himself as a swan jumping from tree to tree, and with his critics trying to catch him in a net. And I think this captures the elusive nature of Plato, because he does have this wonderful poetic style. He is a superbly accessible philosopher. Again, I think his great intellectual contribution to humanity was the importance of abstraction and universal thinking. And yet at the same time, in many ways, none of us would want to live in Plato's utopia. Again, I think one of the ironies is that his great hero, Socrates, I think wouldn't last 5 minutes in Plato's utopia, because of course Socrates is all about questioning everything. Yeah. Whereas in Plato's society, essentially nobody questions anything. So I think just wrapping up Plato, although I say we shouldn't really try to wrap him up, but if we're going to move towards a conclusion, I think this image of him as this uncatchable philosopher, someone who can criticize, someone who can pick apart, but someone who essentially everyone who came after him is permanently in his debt.
And that's the sign of a good philosopher at the end of the day. Someone that you can't quite pin down and whose ideas still permeate.
Exactly. Yeah, this is a sign of one of the greats.
So that brings us to the end of our Plato series. So leave us a comment if you enjoyed that, or if there's anything that you want us to cover. I'm sure Sean will be back with us at some point in the near future. Again, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.